If we look at the events of Groundhog Day from Rita's perspective, it seems pretty unlikely she would actually fall in love with Phil at the end of it. But is it?
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit.
Welcome to the occupation. Hang your collar up inside. Hang your freedom higher.
It's the only way to be sure.
As everyone knows, Groundhog Day is about Phil Connors, an egotistical TV weatherman who gets trapped living the same day over and over and over again. Along the way, he changes on a fundamental level and finally escapes the time loop when he earns the love of the true moral center of the film, his producer, Rita. And it's pretty clear from what's on the screen that Rita does in fact fall for him. Given that, from her point of view, she's only known Phil for a day when he tells her he loves her, that seems to be quite a stretch even for a romantic comedy. This is all the more true since the film shows us how her character reacts to all too quick professions of love during Phil's direct attempts to get into her pants.
I love you.
You love me?
I love you.
You don't even know me.
Oh, I know you. I know you.
Oh no, I can't believe I fell for this.
So how can she have a completely different reaction later in the film? If you've watched any of my other videos about pop culture, you know I don't give writers a pass for leaving out things that really need to be in the text. The audience doesn't need to see a character driving from one place to another to understand that the character has changed location. But forcing the audience to fill in gaps in the plot in order for a work to make sense is a cardinal sin in my book. And at first blush, it would appear that Groundhog Day has in fact committed this sin. There are quite a few videos and articles out there examining the movie from Rita's perspective, and pretty much all of them conclude that at the very least the script cheats a bit and relies on the audience having seen Phil's journey and come to root for him to paper over Rita's irrationally quick acceptance when he tells her he loves her and suggests that they quit their jobs, move to Punxsutawney, and live together. I think the movie actually gave us the answer to this question on the screen and can therefore be absolved. It just didn't do it quite as well as perhaps it should have. Let's go over Phil's side of the story. There are a number of estimates as to how long Phil was stuck in Groundhog Day, ranging from a couple of weeks to as much as 10,000 years. One writer looked at how much time he wasted, how many times he says he died, including ones that weren't shown, how many skills he appears to have mastered and how long such mastery would probably take, and calculated that he was in the loop for an implausibly precise 12,403 days. That comes out to a few days shy of 34 years. The basic argument makes sense, and the result fits with director Harold Ramis's estimate of 30 to 40 years. So as far as I'm concerned, about 34 years is canon. He spent half a lifetime unmaking the person he was when he woke up on February 2nd for the first time, and remaking himself into a person Rita could love and finally earned the right to wake up on February 3rd. During that 34 years or so, he goes through three main phases. First, he realizes he's trapped, comes to accept it, and indulges in all the worst of his natural inclinations. After briefly testing the boundaries of the time loop, he proceeds to lie, cheat, steal, take advantage of others, and generally prove that he really is the self-centered jerk other people think he is. This culminates in a lengthy effort to trick Rita into bed by gradually learning more and more about her, faking a happy accident romantic day in an effort to get in her pants. But Rita sees through him time and time again. Because it's inauthentic, it's just not going to work. This is clearly and unambiguously established on screen. So in the second phase, Phil hits bottom. He gives up on the hedonistic indulgence in his efforts to snooker Rita and heads instead down a path of self-destruction. He tries to end his own life repeatedly, but cannot. The turning point in the film is when he tells Rita what's really going on with him and demonstrates that he really does know everything going on around him. She decides to spend the day with him, and as she's falling asleep, he tells her he could never deserve someone like her, but if he ever could, he'd love her for the rest of his life. When he wakes up, alone, the next morning, everything about his demeanor has changed. And thus begins his third phase, the effort to become worthy of Rita. The film leaves it to us to fill in most of the repetitions, which is fine. It shows him starting down the path to learning the piano and a step or two after that. It shows him dramatically changing his attitude toward Rita and Larry and even the Groundhog Festival. He brings them coffee and pastry, tries to be helpful, and even asks Larry for his opinion on how to do the job they're there to do. Larry's appreciation for being so included is abundantly clear. Rita is perplexed and even a little dubious, but she goes with it when he goes out of his way to include Larry. The first time we see him doing ice sculpture, he's already pretty skilled. Having shown us some of the other things he's doing to improve himself, it is perfectly fine that the script just showed us that he's already acquired this ability. We know enough about what he's up to generally to fill in that blank, and it underscores just how thorough he's being and what kind of time it's taking. Had they left that out entirely and then just shown us the Rita sculpture scene at the end, I would definitely have had an issue with it. But this is actually a good example of a script balancing how much to show and how much to leave the audience to figure out. The last part of his self-improvement arc includes the universe also teaching Phil a large amount of humility during his quest to save the old homeless man. After some number of days trying to save the man, Phil is forced to accept that he can't do everything. And then we get to what will prove to be the final day. He makes the long, lustrous winter speech before a score of people or more. Even other news stations have their microphones on him. Larry is shockingly warm in his response, telling Phil he touched him. Rita is equally impressed, telling Phil she's surprised and inviting him for coffee. The last time she saw him from her own point of view, he was being an egotistical jerk and engaging in low-grade sexual harassment.
You know, I think this is one of the traits of a really good producer. Keep the talent happy.
Anything I can do?
Would you help me with my pelvic tilt?
But now she's asking him for a coffee date. He politely demurs and surprises her again by saying he has some errands to run. He proceeds to run around town helping people until it's time for the party. Rita encounters him again for the first time since the morning and is almost overwhelmed by how much everybody in town seems to love him. Even having had her preconceptions rocked a little that morning, she's still a bit suspicious. His piano teacher is rather a bit too proud of him, bragging to Rita that he's her student. But from her perspective, he's had one lesson that by that point he clearly didn't need. We don't get to hear what Phil tells Rita when she asks for the short version of what's going on with him. There's certainly no time for the whole unvarnished truth before he's on the auction block and she spends what we must assume is every penny in her checking account on him. Then we cut straight to the snow sculpture scene. Phil has now achieved an excellent balance of humble and confident, caring and self-aware. He has, in short, become someone worthy of Rita. And she doesn't even question it when he tells her that he loves her. She says she's happy too. She spends the night and doesn't balk when he acts decidedly weird in the morning and suggests that they start living together in Punxsutawney. The film ends with the clear implication that that's more or less what they're going to do on the way to living happily ever after. So, does that work? Phase 1 Rita immediately and forcefully rejects Phil, telling her that he loves her after spending pretty much an entire day with him. That line worked on Nancy, but Nancy's a ditz. Rita has substance and a very clear idea of what she wants. So how can the film justify her accepting his saying that he loves her on even less exposure, since at the point he says it at the end of the movie they've spent maybe an hour or two together? My theory is bleed through. While only Phil remembers each instance of Groundhog Day, the film only really works if we assume that some of the bad will or goodwill Phil earns each time he lives through it bleeds over into the other instances. But haven't I said that leaving massive plot explanations up to the audience is a major sin? Why, yes, I have. Happily, the text gives us a basis upon which to believe this is in fact the intended explanation.
Would you like to try some white chocolate?
Yuck. Don't make me sick.
No white chocolate.
There is something so familiar about this.
Hmm?
Do you ever have deja vu?
Didn't you just ask me that?
I said earlier that the film didn't handle this issue quite as well as it should have. It's a delicate balance, and the film may have erred on the wrong side of it in an effort to avoid foreshadowing too heavily. But that scene is a clear indication that, at least on some level, Rita's experiencing some bleed-through from her previous encounters with Phil. Structurally, it would have been better if we'd had another nod to the idea that something, however ineffable, would persist between Phil's days, preferably two such nods. But if you watch the film with this idea in mind, there are some subtle examples of it. There's a light touch in the direction and performances from time to time that suggests that characters are reacting to Phil slightly differently. But that could just be confirmation bias on my part. That being said, several of the events from the final day really only make sense if bleed-through is happening. For instance, a goodly portion of the town and even other news people cluster around Phil for his report at the start of the day. Absent some predisposition to thinking he'd come up with something pretty special, doesn't make much sense. His piano teacher is quite emphatic in her pride after he plays at the party. Larry is unbelievably open and appreciative of Phil's speech. Even Nancy having a positive opinion of him when she and Rita enter the party and her being so anxious to win the bid for him suggests he's built up some residual goodwill over time, though she hadn't met him, as far as she knows, before that day either. She's certainly come a long way from the chipmunk thing. Most of the people who approach Phil and Rita while they're dancing have obvious reasons for liking him just from the things that they know he did that day. But Rita's quick acceptance of his profession of love only makes sense if she's unknowingly been drifting that way over a period of time that only Phil remembered. We don't know how close Phil came before that last day. We don't know how many times she bid her entire checking account balance for him. We don't know how many times he carved her face in the ice. We do know that he did not expect this time to be the last. It's entirely possible he saw most or all of those things happen dozens of times. He certainly showed no hesitation in telling her that he loves her. It's not a stretch to conclude that he'd had that conversation multiple times and learned that complete and open honesty was the only viable option. So on a purely surface level, the fact that he's now being authentically honest is a clear difference from his Phase 1 efforts to get with Rita. That in itself gives the script something of an app for why she accepts it this time. Given that the script also showed us that she's experienced at least some kind of bleed-through, the ending of the film works just fine, even if Rita can't explain her own reactions in words.